If history has taught us one thing, is that it's full of villains. Humans and creatures alike have proven to us that despite the countless legends and folklore shared throughout time and around the globe, that no matter what era it is or where you are, you will always find monsters. From the blood-soaked fields sown by Vlad the Impaler after slaying thousands of his foes, to the chupacabra hunting under the moon, searching for small prey to devour, there are countless different versions of what some would consider vessels of evil. Evil beings whose sole purpose was to consume the blood of their victims. Vampires have recently become sensationalized over the past century. Characters and stories born for our entertainment through movies and books we create. By doing this, though, we forget the origins of the creature we like to fantasize about, and the bloody path they've forged throughout history. But where does that history begin? Like everything, there had to be a beginning to the legends, and in this episode, we will be delving into what could possibly be the very first person in all of recorded history to have been known to be a real vampire. Thank you for joining me today, and welcome to the show. Hidden away from most eyes of the world lies a small, unremarkable village nestled away in the hills of the Istrian peninsula of Croatia. Regardless of the fact that it is now home to only around 300 people, the ancient village of Kringa is a little deceiving. Those who eventually do manage to find their way there are often taken aback by the beauty of the medieval architecture. The old stones adorned by thick moss continues to silently stand the test of time, keeping their forgotten secrets to themselves. As peaceful as this small village may appear today, if we travel back in time to the mid-1600s, we find things to be vastly different. There were far more people living there than there is today, and the citizens back then were in trouble. They had a problem they didn't necessarily know how to deal with. There was this man in town, a particularly unfriendly one, to put it lightly. Half the village, more or less, didn't really interact with him and held no opinion of the man one way or the other, while the other half rather despised him. But he was their neighbor after all, and sometimes you just have to swallow your opinion and live with what life has dealt you. As was the case with many farmers and peasants, the lower class at the time didn't exactly have the easiest of lives. Yuri Grando had found himself in this predicament. A life of gruesome, back-breaking labor, toiling in the blistering fields and earning very little in return. Over the years, this took its toll on the man whose anger and resentment towards the rest of the world grew with each passing season. To the dismay of all his neighbors, they unfortunately found themselves constantly struggling with guilt. The village itself was populated strictly by Roman Catholics, who were devout followers of their beliefs. This then prevented them to wish harm onto their neighbor, as unruly and deserving of it as he might have been. You would maybe understand their relief then, when word started to spread around town that poor old Yuri wasn't doing too well health-wise. Each night when the villagers turned in for the evening, behind the safety of closed doors, they silently smiled to themselves, hoping the reaper would soon come for their neighbor. And to their pleasure, they didn't have to wait very long. You see, just a week after falling ill, Yuri Grando collapsed in his home and just moments later finally took his last breath, and he eventually died on a cold, windless night in 1656. His funeral was held the next day, put together by the few sympathetic people employed by the church, and was only attended by his mournful wife Ivana and his two young children, Anna and Nikola. As they stood at the gravesite mourning the loss of their husband and father, the rest of the villagers remained home, naively celebrating in their own private ways at not having to deal with Yuri any longer. Little did they know, their interactions with the man would not end with his death, and the following night after his funeral, Yuri Grando returned to town. Tucking her children into their beds, Ivana quietly blew out the bedside candle, plunging their room into a faint darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon shining through the window allowed Ivana enough vision to exit their room quietly and make her way into the hall to head to her own. As she did so, thoughts of her future lingered long in her mind. Without Yuri, the future was uncertain, and it was this thought that kept her up tossing and turning throughout the night. The entire village was blanketed by a cover of unnatural silence that night. While everyone gradually settled down and the last person slowly drifted off to sleep, there was one person whose eyes slowly opened. Though what he saw wasn't the ominous glow of the moon or the light of any burning candle, his eyes were rather met with pure blackness. Yuri Grando reached his long, slender arm forward, slowly pushing the wooden door of his casket open. He peered into the stars above and knew his time had finally come. He had cheated death and was eager to get to work. A cold fog had descended onto Kringa, its residents thankful to be warm indoors. But their deep sleep had been interrupted. Every now and then, the faint sounds of knocking at their front doors pulled them out of their slumber and drew them to the door. But when they opened it, they were met with an empty doorstep. When they peered outside, trying in vain to shield themselves from the biting air, the imposing figure of a man slowly walking down the street disappeared from their vision as the fog calmly overtook him. They didn't know who that mysterious stranger was, but their tired minds didn't put much thought into it. House after house was visited by this shadowy man, but no one learned his identity that night. He didn't allow them. Yuri shambled along the cobblestone streets, taking great consideration on whose house he stopped at and which door he knocked on. As his mission drew to an end, Yuri finally had come to his old home, the place where his sleeping children rested just behind the safety of the glass window, and his wife, who was struggling to find the rest she desperately sought. But instead of knocking on the door like he had done so with so many houses in the village already, Yuri reached for the handle and let himself in. Taking a moment to fully appreciate the fact he was in his old house, he stared at the mementos of his family, carefully placed around the room. Before, he might have had some reaction to seeing his children's toys strewn about the house, or the freshly baked bread left out on the kitchen table made by his wife. But something in him had changed. He wasn't the man he was a day ago. But he did know one thing. This was his family, and his family will always be his. He slowly made his way to his old bedroom, where he found his wife. Imagine her surprise when, through her already restless sleep, her eyes opened for just a second to see her supposed-to-be dead husband standing in the doorway staring at her. Ivana sat up with a start, unable to separate real life from her dreams. She had just buried her husband mere hours ago, but here he was, standing in the room with her. Completely speechless, she struggled to find the words that escaped her. She didn't move or made a sound, afraid of what was going on. Yuri Grando, as much as death had changed him, it hadn't changed the fact that he was a foul person. His reasoning for returning to his house was different than the reasoning for visiting his neighbors. He had returned because he still believed his wife was still his and expected her to fulfill her marital duties. Obviously, I won't be going into any more details, but as one could imagine, this was something Ivana hadn't wanted. The man she had put to rest that same day was now forcing her to do the unthinkable. The nightmares that plagued her restless sleep now had become reality. When the light of dawn finally came, and after Yuri had departed the house he once called his home, the villagers awoke to the ear-piercing screams of Ivana, still traumatized at what had just happened. As neighbors rushed to her aid, they burst through the front door to find her pale as a ghost, still gripping the bedsheets with an iron, white-knuckled grip. Through all of her hysteria, she was able to get out just 3 words. Yuri was back. Of course, her neighbors stared at her, then to each other in disbelief. Yuri was dead. He was buried just yesterday. But no matter how much they tried to convince Ivana, she knew her husband was still alive somehow. This was when some of them began to wonder. A few of them had been visited by a shadowy stranger in the dead of night, though none of them were able to identify him. They still doubted the mysterious figure was an undead Yuri, but just to be safe, several villagers volunteered to stay awake that night, just to see if the man returned. Sure enough, their caution paid off, and once again, house after house in Kringa was visited by the ghostly figure of Yuri. Those who remained awake were greeted with his hulking figure, standing on their doorstep, knocking with his bony hand. Those still awake were far too afraid to confront the man wandering their streets, and as soon as they discovered his identity, they knew what he truly was: a Strigoi. Strigois were rare. For a person to become one, they would have to be guilty of crimes unimaginable. They were believed to have been sorcerers, magicians practicing spells and rituals going against the teachings of the church. They would feast on the blood of animals and children during their lifetimes, and when their human souls expired, the Strigoi would take over. An undead, monstrous form would replace their former host's body, with the ability to transform into animals, shroud themselves with invisibility, and the unnatural talent of draining the vitality of their victims. These deadly monsters of legend emulate the image of the pure vampire, creatures full of hate, fury, and hunger. The villagers of Kringa were out of their element. They, of course, had grown up hearing stories and fables about these terrifying villains, but they never had expected they would ever come across one, let alone one that used to be someone they knew. To make matters worse, as legend told, when a Strigoi knocked on someone's door, someone in that home was then destined to die soon. This unnerved everyone in town, as for the past few nights, Yuri continued to return and made it his mission to knock on as many doors as he could under the cover of darkness. Those who had heard or seen him knocking on their own door grew paranoid with each passing day, and it wasn't long before everyone in town shared the same chilling fear. Night after night, Yuri would rise from his grave, slowly sulk into town, and go about this routine. The villagers dreaded that slow, hollow knock, and Ivana that nightly visit from the corpse of her cold, dead husband. Strigois, while were oftentimes rarely encountered, were, by nature, known to be extremely dangerous. But how did one become this legendary creature? Being so uncommon, the circumstances that would turn one into a Strigoi were rather elaborate back during the 1600s, but of course by today's standards could be seen as rather straightforward. By far the most difficult way one would become one of these vampiric beasts is by being born the 7th same-sex child in your family. Statistically, this would be rather difficult, but fully possible. Your 6 brothers or 6 sisters would lead normal lives, but according to folklore, from your birth, you would become possessed by the vampiric spirit. For young families starting out hundreds of years ago, the chances of having 7 boys or 7 girls was just as statistically difficult as it would be today. But back then, infant mortality rates were drastically different than what they are in today's age. For each child born into a single family back then to survive, and then for all of them to be of the same gender, would create an oddity so rare, superstitions surrounding the 7th child grew into folklore. The next few are rather easier to come across. Other ways one could become a Strigoi was die by execution before pre-jury, or die from the results of a witch's curse. There's also dying of old age without being married. Now back during the 1600s and being a fairly religious dominant society at the time, the likelihood of a person dying of old age without becoming married at some point in their lives would be rather rare, hence why this was considered one of the ways an individual could become a Strigoi. There's also dying by suicide. Again, being mainly a religious dominant society, suicide was, as it is today, completely discouraged. Those who unfortunately found the need to end their lives prematurely often would be thought to return as a tortured lost soul, bent on disrupting the lives of those still living. There's also the classics of being bitten by an individual who is already a Strigoi, being born with an extra nipple or small tail, dying before being baptized, or being born as a child out of marriage. But now we finally then come to the last way someone was said to be transformed into a Strigoi, and again it leads us back to the religious dominance angle. Those who lived a life of sin, behaving outside the rules and teachings of the church, were often considered to be evil in life, as well as in death. This was a way the church would control their numbers, by convincing the world around them that those who stray from the word of the church were likely evil beings, causing many to consider those sinners as disruptive and unwanted members of society. By doing this, the church holds a firm and controlled grip on the population, which leads me to believe Yuri Grando was likely guilty of this particular condition, which led people to believe he had become a Strigoi after his death. From the story, we know Yuri was a very unliked person around town. We aren't filled in on why exactly he was so hated, but if we consider the other conditions that are supposed to create a Strigoi, we find the others don't necessarily fit Yuri's description. We know he didn't die by suicide or by execution before pre-jury. He was also married and likely wasn't cursed by a witch. He, of course, could have been the seventh son of his family, but the probability of that being the case back then was unlikely. So this leads me to believe he was an individual who went against the norms of the town and the church and decided he wouldn't bend to religious pressure. This then caused a rift between him and the rest of town, which is why most of the residents practically shunned him, and also why they believed he had come back as a Strigoi after death, because he didn't follow the church and was believed to have lived a life of sin. When we really delve into the legend, we can see how it might have been born. The ancient folklore surrounding Strigoi claims they are often considered to be incredibly dangerous and are said to rise from the grave to torment their own family and relatives and anyone else who they deem worthy of their nightly visits. It is said they often avoid being out during daylight hours, as it makes them weaker and drowsy, leaving them to only go about their visits under the cover of night. Yuri Grando fits the description of a Strigoi exactly. So if the man truly was one of these, how dangerous was he? Like I had mentioned, as an adversary, these monstrosities possessed a number of abilities to combat any would-be monster hunter of the time, with the ability to transform into animals, disappear from sight, effectively extract life from their victims, as well as having incredible strength and speed. It was common for suspected Strigois to have lasting reigns of terror, solely held by the fear they casted on their territory. Their sole purpose on this earth was to consume the flesh and blood of humans, but primarily craved the innocent blood and flesh of infants and children. Strigois like Yuri were also said to be immortal, making them very dangerous enemies if left unchecked. Of course, there are hundreds of different sources saying one thing and others saying another, so for the conditions a person must go through to become a Strigoi may vary from person to person or book to book. Popular vampiric media tells us vampires are creatures either born from vampiric parents or are created by being bitten by another vampire. Different cultures around the world have different legends, conditions, and methods in how vampires truly act, are supposed to act, what classifications they are, and ways on how to deal with them when you have the unfortunate luck of coming across one. So, you might be thinking now, how did the villagers of Kringa back in the 1600s deal with the threat Yuri presented to them? Well, as the story went, they didn't address it for quite a while. 16 years, in fact. Yuri would return from the grave every night, and under the cover of the dark sky and glowing moon, he struck his fangs of fear into the Istrian peninsula. For 16 long years, the residents of Kringa and the surrounding area were forced to play host against their undead foe, and it wasn't until 1672 did things finally come to a head. Years of torment and begging did little to grant the compassion and defense Ivana constantly pleaded for. While Yuri visited and abused her, the townsfolk knew if they tried to intervene, surely their doors would be knocked on the following night, and their fates sealed. It was cowardly not to help, but what could they do against an undead monster who held all their lives by a thread? They were all terrified. What would happen if they opposed him? Could they actually somehow end his life a second time? These questions were amongst the many asked at the town meeting put together by the mayor, Miho Redidik. He, along with almost everyone else in town, had been trying to come up with a solution to their problem for quite some time now. 16 years is a long period to be scared, and the villagers of Kringa had finally had enough. Mayor Miho announced to the attendees at the meeting that he, and along with the church's priest, Father Giorgio, were planning on striking Yuri while he rested. By going to his grave, they planned to be rid of the evil that plagued their town once and for all. But they needed help. He eyed the audience and asked if there were any brave men there willing to put themselves at risk for the greater good of the village. Slowly, one hand rose above the small sea of worried townsfolk, then another and another. 8 men in total eventually raised their hands and pledged their allegiance to Miho and Giorgio. They were willing to face Yuri, whatever the cost. But they needed to act fast. With each passing minute, the sun drew closer to the horizon, and they knew if Yuri awoke while they were there to kill him, they wouldn't stand a chance against his supernatural powers. Trusting that the power of their god would help guide them to justice, the men marched to the small graveyard behind the church and prepared themselves as best they could. The 10 strong, capable men gathered around Yuri's grave, each one hesitant to be the first to drive their shovel into the earth. But the pressure of the falling sun weighed heavy on their minds, and before any of them tried to back out, Mayor Miho drove his spade into the dirt, leading the others to do the same. With every shovelful, they found their task harder and harder to follow through with. They knew the thin layer of earth was the only thing separating them from their worst nightmare, and they were in the process of removing that barrier. Every one of them grew more hesitant as more dirt was moved, but peering up and seeing the light was soon leaving them, they stayed focused and determined to follow through. Before they knew it, they came face to face with the closed casket, and Father Giorgio stood over the open grave, citing a prayer from his holy book, and held out his small wooden crucifix. Mayor Miho knelt down in the disturbed dirt with another, and the 2 men slowly creaked open the old wooden casket, its rusted hinges breaking free to reveal the perfectly preserved body of 16 years long dead Yuri. Plastered on his face was a distorted grin, rosy cheeks, and dead, wide eyes staring up at them. Giorgio continued on again with his prayer, hoping the word of his Lord would be enough to weaken the body frozen before them. One of the other men, armed with a hawthorn wooden stake, knelt down on the opposite side of Miho and the other, and raised the stake up, ready to shoot it down onto the corpse. But just before he was about to bring it down, the men noticed the corpse of Yuri began to excrete tears from his eyes. It was difficult to notice at first, but with the flickering light from their lanterns, they were clearly there. The fact their lanterns were their main source of light quickly dawned on Miho. They were running out of time, and the sun was now reduced only to a faint orange glow off in the distance. He swiped the stake away from the frozen man across from him, and with a single thrust, brought the stake down directly onto Yuri's chest, aiming straight for his heart. But it didn't work. The sharpened stake had no effect on Yuri's body. As soon as it made contact, it didn't pierce the dead skin, but simply had just bounced off to the side. It did happen to have one effect though. The unnerving smile on Yuri's face slowly stretched longer, as if he was taunting the men with the fact they could not end him like they had believed. With only a few minutes of sunlight left in the day, the men scrambled to find a solution. They've come this far. They knew there was no coming back from this if they failed. As the group were arguing what their next steps should be, Father Giorgio paused and turned towards the church. The old but hefty wood-splitting axe he used on occasion just so happened to be resting against the side of the stone wall, as if it was begging to help. Giorgio broke off from the rest of the group, causing most of them to initially believe he was retreating from the scene. But once their eyes saw him reaching for the heavy axe, they knew what his plan was. The strongest man of the group, Stipan Malisic, took the axe from the father to allow him to conduct more prayers, and as he slowly stood over the open grave, Yuri's confident smile quickly changed. Stipan slowly raised the heavy axe above his head, and everyone paused in anticipation for what surely was going to decide the fate of the town, one way or the other. The blade of the axe was sharp, and Stipan's grip was firm. He brought it down directly onto Yuri's neck, effectively separating his head from the rest of his body. As soon as the blade broke the skin, a howling screech filled the evening air, as Yuri opened his mouth one last time and cried out at the world. Before their eyes, the men surrounding the grave watched in horror as Yuri's face contorted with a horrifying stare, then slowly began leaking an unsettling amount of blood, filling the entire grave. Knowing their mission had been a success, the men stood in disbelief. The monster that had been tormenting their community had finally been vanquished. For the first time in over a decade and a half, the village of Kringa could finally rest easy. As with all folklore, legends like the Vampire of Kringa are often brought to life by some underlying truth, mixed with a little bit of exaggeration. Yuri Grando was a real person, and he did live in the village of Kringa. But was he really a Strigoi, or vampire as he was described in the story? As the legend told, when Yuri would visit a home, those living there were said to be doomed to die a short time later, after those fateful knocks echoed out into the night. It's not exactly known how often Yuri had visited these homes or made visits to his terrified widow, but according to the story, it was a nightly occurrence. But if we take a step back from the tale and use logic for a second, it's highly unlikely the man would have made these visits a nightly tradition. Otherwise, the population of Kringa would have been diminished into nothing over the course of a few years. Remember, it said he made visits to multiple homes, but let's say even if he only knocked on one house a night, that would still mean 365 people would die every year. I'm not sure what the population of Kringa might have been in the year 1656 when Yuri initially died, but if he did this every night for 16 years like the story claims, that would mean around 5,840 people would have been killed by Yuri during his reign. For a small village in the Istrian countryside such as Kringa, this seems fairly unlikely. But this is of course only a possibility if the man himself truly was what the villagers claimed him to be even. Maybe there was something else that happened in Kringa back in 1656. It may be grasping at straws to explain this situation, but perhaps Yuri was a victim of murder, and his murderer just hadn't done a good enough job. Perhaps after being publicly buried in the church's cemetery, Yuri awoke in his yet-to-be-covered grave, having suffered a concussion to the head and blacked out for several hours. Maybe he then climbed out of his grave and strolled back into town, and the legend had simply grown around this horrifying mistake or crime. Throughout all of history, there have been plenty of accidental buryings of people who thought to have died, but had ended up awakening after being trapped in the ground. This is evident throughout history as grave robbers continuously would find scratch marks on the inside of coffins of those poor souls attempting to dig themselves free, or the practice of creating an alarm system for those who might have been buried by mistake, a small string leading from inside the coffin up to above ground and to the small bell that could be rung to notify someone of the mistake. Certainly, it's possible Yuri could have been one of these mistaken burials, and then the story of him being an undead Strigoi was born as the years passed by. The legend itself has mostly survived in oral stories passed on from parents to their children over the course of a few hundred years, so there's bound to be some inaccuracies in it. But historian Johann Werkhard von Valvassor, man, that's a mouthful, who lived during the same time Yuri was supposedly conducting his reign of terror, wrote in his book The Glory of the Duchy of Carniola about the events happening in Kringa. Now, full disclosure, I haven't read this ancient book, so I'm basing most of this information off of online sources. The book focuses on a number of different topics ranging from history, geography, topography, medicine, biology, geography, theology, customs, and of course, folklore. Apparently in his book, Johann writes about vampires, which became widely known as being one of the earliest surviving texts in existence that describes these monsters. Yes, the story of Yuri Grando mainly survives on through spoken word, but Johann Valvassor was the one to put it onto paper. Like I said though, I have not read this encyclopedia consisting of 15 books and written in High German, so I'm mainly basing what I'm saying right now off of a few online local history websites claiming he wrote about Yuri. But until I either learn how to read New High German or find a copy of his writings about Yuri translated into English, I'm afraid I can't say much right now as to the contents of what he specifically wrote about. Regardless of this though, the legend of Yuri certainly is a strange one. The fact he was a real person who was believed to have returned from the dead to extract torment on those he left behind, and whose story has survived for 350 years, certainly has become one of history's most interesting folklores. Through recent years, pop culture surrounding vampires have really taken off. In movies and books, different varieties of vampires, how they behave, how to become one, and how to kill one slightly differ depending on which source you want to look at. Yuri Grando, though, may have very well been one of the men to inspire the creation of how we know vampires to be today. And it's today, the citizens of Kringa no longer have any fear of the night. The threat of vampires have long left this small Istrian village, but the locals still like to believe in the existence of these monsters. Even though their very ancestors were hunted and killed by one, they have fully embraced their history as being home of one of the very first vampires. In a very special kind of way, the spirit of Yuri Grando is very much alive again today. The locals, now no longer fearing the man who haunted their village, have found the legend to become an incredible source of income. History buffs and tourists from all over Europe travel to this otherwise unnoticeable village to experience the grand medieval architecture hiding a fragment of lost human history that is truly horrifying yet fascinating. Yuri Grando, the man who died, came back as a monster, then died again 350 years ago, has been brought back once more in our modern age, in the form of not a monster, but rather as a captivating legend. Thanks for listening to what I believe is the first vampire episode I've done on the podcast. I'm surprised it took me so long to cover an actual vampire that wasn't some kind of animal like the Beast of Bladenborough, I think. But if you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, head on over to moonlightlore.com to find all things relating to the podcast. An archive of episodes, pictures, information, news, and how to support the show is all waiting for you. If you are looking for more content, I produce bonus episodes on patreon.com once a month. I think I have 2 on there right now, and I'm writing a third. And for as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to every single bonus content I post there in the future. It's basically the cost of a cup of coffee or 2 a month, and it goes a long way in helping support the show by helping with the cost of running the website, hosting fees, editing software, and all that other stuff. I personally don't like ads on other shows, so I want to keep my show as ad-free as possible so the flow of the show doesn't get interrupted. So if you have the means to do so, please consider donating to the podcast Patreon. Once again, you can find the Patreon by going down to the description of this episode and following the link, or going to moonlightlore.com and finding the support link there, or just going on to patreon.com and searching up Moonlight Lore Podcast. However, I know not everyone can donate at this time, so if you are still wanting to support the show, the next best way is by sharing it with your friends and family, as well as leaving a 5-star review on whatever app you might be listening on. Leaving a review is a quick and easy way to show support, and sharing it with your friends and family helps grow the show, and I would be incredibly grateful for you doing so. If you ever wanted to reach out and say hi, or have a fun story to tell, you can always reach me at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or by direct messaging me on Instagram at Moonlight Lore Podcast. I love hearing from you guys, so don't ever hesitate to reach out. At the moment, I believe that's finally it for this episode. Another one in the books, as they say. So, as always, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Have a good day.